The first stellar vanguard of the Trellian Confederacy, nicknamed Venerable for its long service under the Confederate banner, was feared by the nations of the galaxy. It had ended hostile aggression without firing a shot, negotiated favorable trade deals with only the presence of its mighty hulls, made the enemies of the Confederacy tremble in 100 battles. It was said that even rumors of the presence of the venerable First Vanguard was enough to make pirates in a region cease their operations for months at a time. The reputation of the Venerable First stretched so far and wide that even spacers on the far end of the galaxy had heard tales of its battles, how it dashed the Abraxian armada among the asteroid belt of Varys, how it forced the world of Eaters of Enrai back to their despoiled homeworld, before leading the Confederate charge to eradicate them once and for all, how it waged war for 2 decades against the humans of Earth, shattering their mightiest fleets and condemning their best admirals to an airless grave, until the apes miraculously managed to bring that storied fleet low. This is not the first story of the rise or battles of the venerable First Vanguard. This is the story of its end. The Venerable First entered the Canaan system believing its single colonized world to be a bastion like any other, ringed with early warning arrays, guarded by orbital defense platforms, and dotted with surface-to-space cannons, an anvil upon which the hammer of the Trellian Confederacy was meant to beat until it broke. But of course, the Venerable had encountered many such anvils over its 200 years of service, and it had not broken upon a single one. The humans were a formidable species, and none could deny it even then. But any human who thought Canaan would be the end of the First Vanguard had fallen into the same way of thinking as the Varsians and the Prekiars, and the greatest technicians of a score of other species that had all been proven wrong. The venerable First Vanguard was confident in its victory as it passed through the Canaan system's asteroid belt. As was typical of their enemies, the human fleet had pulled back its assets to attempt to strike the Confederate vanguard as one cohesive unit. A wise strategy, one made exponentially more effective with the addition of minefields, stationary defenses, or flanking units, but ineffective against the First Vanguard. Still, they would have been foolish not to be wary. The 8th Vanguard, nicknamed Indomitable for its many victories against overwhelming odds, had perished to such maneuvers just 2 weeks earlier. Confederate survivors confirmed that the fleet had been annihilated almost to a ship, but the venerable First Vanguard was above such a defeat. As per their standard doctrine, the ships of the venerable First scouted and secured the outer system first. Typically, an insertion directly toward the objective would be preferable, but the human stellar navy's proficiency in ambushes and guerrilla warfare was such that the Trellians could not afford to leave any stones unturned. The new invasion doctrine, developed after 2 vanguards were destroyed in devastating ambushes and 3 more left to rot when their supply lines failed, was written in Trellian blood. Of course, the First Vanguard had experienced none of these problems. Its crews were experienced and trained beyond anything the human fleet had faced before. Any ambushes their enemy sprung were batted aside with contemptuous force, and their skill in logistics and maneuvering was such that any exposed supply convoys proved to be only a death trap for the raiders who dared to claim them. Many a human privateer had perished, face contorted in disbelief, as visibly unarmed Confederate transports shed their outer hulls to reveal a surface bristling with weapons. It was said by Confederate analysts that the First Vanguard alone reduced fleet-wide losses to supply raids by nearly 20%. When Confederate Stellar Command began to integrate their new style of fighting into the rest of the fleet's doctrine, those numbers became much more favorable for them. It was a testament to the valor and competence of the venerable First Vanguard that, even against the power that would be their undoing, they still earned a reputation as foes to be feared. Some humans, high on stories, boasting their supremacy and riding the wave of a few early victories, believed the Trellian Confederacy's best would be little more than a speed bump on their road to galactic dominance. Their illusions of a quick and easy victory were broken at about the same time as their fleets. As the war ground on and the Confederate military pressed further into human space, The human defensive effort became focused around one single fleet. Not the conquering 5th Vanguard, which had broken the 3rd and 7th Terran armadas over the colony world of New California. Not the unstoppable 12th Vanguard, which had brought low the storied 8th Terran armada and forced their crippled flagship into the clutches of a black hole. Not the vigilant 2nd Vanguard, which had hunted and destroyed the feared Wolfpack stealth fleet to end the days of human privateers once and for all. These exploits, while all impressive, paled in comparison to the fighting record of the venerable 1st Vanguard. They were the tip of the Confederate spear. Wherever the fighting was thickest, they were there. The bastion of Canaan, where they assaulted now, had turned aside 2 stellar vanguards already. The human military had invested nearly all their resources and might into beating back the Confederacy here. If they lost, they would have no other choice but to surrender. If they won, if they broke the venerable 1st and showed the galaxy that David could beat Goliath, then the Trellians' position would be poor indeed. The more powerful a nation became, the more enemies it amassed. And the Trellians, though they were hated indeed, had long kept their foes at bay with the legendary might of their 1st Vanguard. Its military power was formidable to the extreme, but greater still was its power as part of the Trellian propaganda machine. The venerable 1st Vanguard was something larger than life, a legend given form, and, if that legend was destroyed, the Confederacy would be hard-pressed not to follow it. The battle for Canaan would be critical. The Trellian fleet, while they expected a certain victory, had to approach this engagement warily. None of them felt brave or foolish enough to charge into the fray and expose their fleet to an ambush or flanking maneuver. The humans they fought were, as Confederate battle reports undeniably testified, usually beatable in a fair fight. Of course, that only gave their foes an incentive not to fight fair. Any Confederate commander who underestimated the human military was sure to pay dearly for it. The venerable 1st Vanguard completed their sweep of the outer system within 30 Terran hours, having encountered no human resistance, apart from a few probing assaults and one incursion from the 6th Terran Armada, which had been caught by the 1st Vanguard's pincer formation as it hastened to reinforce the defenses of Canaan. It, faced with the best of the Confederate space fleet, was forced to surrender within minutes. But the 6th Terran Armada was not critical to Canaan's defense. It had 2 armadas already there, and shipyards and supplies enough to keep them in operation indefinitely. And, as the Confederate fleet would soon discover, a single secret weapon they were about to reveal. "Report!" the commander of the venerable 1st, an aged and grizzled veteran by the name of Asvori, demanded. He surveyed the assembled fleet before him, all proven in battle against the Confederacy's many enemies, and listened intently as his officers provided him with a status update.
"The 6th Armada's remaining ships have been secured and disarmed, Vanguard Commander. However, our capacity to hold prisoners is now severely reduced. The 1st Vanguard's brigs are nearly full."
The officer who reported this had not even looked up from her status panel. A lesser commander might have been insulted at the lack of respect. But the venerable 1st Vanguard was led by a man of sterner stuff. Results were Commander Asvori's only requirement. "Send engineers to the 6th Armada's ships and convert certain rooms into brigs," the Vanguard commander ordered. "The engineering teams and their charges will remain behind as we assault Canaan. With luck, they'll be done quickly enough to have new cells ready for the prisoners we will take."
"Sir, is that wise?"
asked another of the commander's subordinates.
"The Vanguard will need combat repairs. We'll be sustaining heavy damage."
If only to emphasize his point, he showed Commander Asvori a diagram of what the Confederacy knew about Canaan's defenses. Asvori was looking at the second most fortified world in all of human space, perhaps even the first, if the 6th Armada had really been called from the defenses of Earth. "You have a good point, Battery Commander," Asvori complimented his officer. Even in the ranks of the venerable 1st, a select few spacers stood apart. The officers surrounding Vanguard Commander Asvori had been hand-picked from these few elites. It was expected of them to consider all aspects of a plan, even those beyond their ability to control. The battery commander in question was one of 6 in command of the Vanguard flagship's point defense systems. "I will withhold my engineers. It is best not to underestimate the humans." Then he turned to his navigation commander. "Ahead full," he ordered. "It is time to engage." "Attention, all ships of the First Vanguard," Commander Asvori spoke into a communications channel. "This is the Vanguard flagship Exemplary. We are commencing our attack on the Canaan defense perimeter. Follow Invasion Doctrine 7. There was no need for rousing speeches with the First Vanguard. No need for inspiring words or great shows of power. These men and women were the elite of the Trellian Confederacy. They would do their duty because it was theirs to do. The venerable First Vanguard began their incursion into the defensive sphere around Canaan. As Commander Asvori predicted, the human military did not engage his fleet even after they had entered the outer defensive sphere. The orbital guns of Canaan were formidable, even after Confederate saboteurs had been tasked with disabling them, and no Terran commander wanted to tangle with the best of the Confederate fleet outside the firing range of his most powerful assets. Data from the Trellians' 2 failed assaults showed the Canaan orbital defenses were capable of destroying even capital ships with only a few salvos from their heavy railgun network. The human fleet, if they were smart, would hide their numbers on the far side of Canaan and wait for Commander Asvori to order a charge on the planet's orbital guns. If he did not, they would peck away at his fleet from range and force the venerable First Vanguard into their first defeat of the war. If he did, they'd spring out at him from behind the planet and make scrap metal of his ships in a close-quarters ambush. At least, that was the idea of it. But, as any Confederate or human officer well knew, ideas meant nothing until they were put into action. And Commander Asvori had plans to put a few ideas of his own to the test. "We have a sensor bead on the Canaan guns," said the Exemplary's sensor commander. "It's not clear enough for a firing solution, but we have readings. 29 guns in total from our perspective. More will come into play as the planet rotates." "Have the fleet intensify shields and begin evasive maneuvers," Asvori calmly ordered, though there was no visible threat. His officers, however, knew better than to question the brilliant commander. As railgun slugs the size of school buses began to whiz past the Confederate fleet, they saw the wisdom in evasive action.
"We've lost the faithful!"
a liaison cried out. The Confederate corvette Faithful, a veteran of many battles, had been struck on the bow by a Canaanite railgun. If the sensor readings were correct, there was nothing left of the ship but shrapnel.
"My stars, those railguns are powerful!"
"I suspected they might attempt a crippling initial strike," Commander Asvori explained, "in order to decimate our numbers before we had a chance to return fire." That initial strike, though it had passed by to little effect, would have been crippling indeed. If those railgun slugs had hit, the losses would have been severe. 1/3 of the fleet, by Asvori's calculations. "Thankfully, the strike seems to have been ineffective. And if my intelligence is correct, the Canaan orbital batteries will be out of power for quite some time afterward. Ideal for us, but not very good for them." He apprised the tactical map before him with a keen eye for strategy. Confederate officers had to be adept at predicting the enemy's next move, especially so when fighting humans, but there was no commander alive who was better at it than Asvori. "They gambled and lost," he concluded. "Now it is time to make them pay what is owed." The human fleet, now facing the very real risk of losing their orbital defense network before the real fight began, were forced out of their hiding places on the far side of Canaan. First Vanguard sensors detected at least 60 ships, many more than their own 47, and backed by an array of heavy orbital batteries, but they had neither the skill nor experience of the venerable First Vanguard, and, as their unrelenting advance into human space had proven, the ships of the Trellian Stellar Navy were unmatched by any of the galaxy's powers. Even the very metal in the Exemplary's hull had been welded together with finesse that outmatched that of any human shipyard. The fight, while very obviously not in the Confederacy's favor, was by no means unwinnable.
Sustaining fire, a sensor commander reported. Long-range batteries, likely from the human ships. I count 16 capital class, 20 city class, 24 settlement class. They're focusing on the exemplary.
A railgun round disintegrated against the flagship's forward shields. Volleys of missiles, though impressive in their own right, were shredded efficiently and easily by the 1st Vanguard's interlinked point defenses.
Bring the exemplary and our capital ships up to form a battle line,
Commander Asvori ordered his navigation commander and liaison.
I want pickets surrounding us to keep those missiles at bay. Have the small craft divert power to defensive batteries, sacrificing offensive fire, and give the capital ships free rein to open up on the human fleet.
He selected a suitably large Canaanite dreadnought for his first target.
Lock weapons onto that capital class, he ordered. Fire at will.
The kinetic weapons of the human space fleet, while undeniably powerful, paled in comparison to the directed energy arrays of the Trellian stellar vanguards. With a series of precise strikes, the battle line of the Venerable First opened up their first salvo of the engagement. Blinding lances of energy struck the human dreadnought's shields. Its defenses were formidable, as were those of any ship of its class, but there was nothing it could do against the concentrated fire of the Confederacy's best ships. A squadron of smaller craft clustered in front of the Hulk after only a few salvos, shielding it with their own hulls to cover its retreat. Asvori's ships switched targets immediately, crippling another capital ship in a focused barrage of energy fire. By then, his fleet had lost several pickets to railgun shots, but the 1st Vanguard was resilient. A few small craft were inconsequential to Commander Asvori's grand plans of victory.
Take 1/3 of the battle line's guns, and have them begin charging their shots. On my order, have them target and fire upon the following vessels, Asvori commanded. With the other 2/3, commence firing on the rightmost capital class.
His guns switched targets. His fleet continued closing the distance. And, after launching 8 separate fusillades from the 1st Vanguard's most powerful guns, he watched as a Terran battleship spilled shrapnel and crew into the ink. It attempted to limp away as its 2 predecessors had done, coiling up a bulwark of small craft to cover its escape, but Asvori had learned the human's playbook.
Coil up the charging batteries,
he ordered his liaison and his battery commanders.
Have them open fire.
Lances of white energy slammed into many of the human escort's shields. Within a few strikes, they were overwhelmed. Their destruction followed shortly afterward. The battleship, crippled and limping, was left without its much-needed guardians.
All ships, focus fire on that wounded capital. Execute at will.
One short barrage later, it was dust.
Call back the Iron and Blood. That ship needs repairs. Bring up the Allegiant to take its spot in the firing line.
The Trellian fleet was not invincible, but they were venerable, and that, in Commander Asvori's mind, would be enough.
"We've entered mid-range, sir," an officer announced. "Sustaining fire from their mid-range guns. Our shields are holding at 70%.
Split the fleet into 4 task squadrons under the parameters I will give you, Asvori ordered his officers. These squadrons will each diverge from the main fleet as a whole and focus their attention on individual ships. We will charge their lines in 4 cohesive units, pierce through them, and then maneuver our ships behind their forward elements.
This would leave Canaan's orbital defenses exposed, as well as give the Confederate fleet an ideal position in between the Terran armadas and the planet they were set to defend. It would be a costly victory, but a victory nonetheless. Commander Asvori was not so foolish as to underestimate an enemy as crafty as the humans, but even his analytical mind saw little his foes could do against the might of the 1st Vanguard. This battle, it seemed, would be just another victory for the Trellian Confederacy.
Task Squadron 1, you're with me, Commander Asvori ordered. Target that city class. I want them to redirect their forces again.
Asvori gave similar orders to his other 3 squadrons, and they were carried out with haste. The Trellian fleet had lost 8 ships so far, not insignificant for the Venerable First, but their human opponents had lost 13. Without the support of their orbital railguns, the Kanan defense fleet was finding itself woefully outmatched against the intellectually and technologically superior Trellians. Asvori watched with pride as a volley of particle lances from 3 Trellian craft struck and crippled a human destroyer. The remaining defenders, predictably, scrambled their ships to cover it as it limped back behind friendly lines.
Task squadrons, switch to alternate targets.
Commander Asvori had known they would.
Divert power from shields to engines. Let's punch through their lines and clean up low orbit before their heavy guns recharge.
As he commanded, the 4 task squadrons suddenly switched their attack vectors, catching the human fleet off guard. Their powerful weapons blasted holes in the enemy formation, and their engines supercharged so they could slip through the gaps. For a moment, the defense force was in disarray. But the best of the Terran Space Force was not to be underestimated. The human fleet immediately began an organized retreat, launching thousands of foggy sensor signatures forward to cover their escape. 2 Trellian craft, though already weakened, were shredded as the signatures exploded in close proximity to their hulls.
Stealth mines, Asvori snapped. Sensor Commander, do we have a fix?
No, Vanguard Commander!
The Exemplary's sensory commander hunched over a screen, tapping frantically at his controls.
The mines are cloaked! We can detect them, but our defense batteries will be hard-pressed to fire on those targets. What are your orders?
Asvori thought for a moment.
Cluster the fleet together in their squadrons, and have them link sensor feeds and defensive fire between the ships. We cannot clear the minefield, but we can clear a path through it.
He returned to studying the tactical map. The Venerable First would get the job done, that much was certain, but it was already too late. The human fleet had reformed ranks in a close formation around their orbital cannons. They were firing through the minefield to devastating effect against the Venerable First Vanguard, and, if Asvori's ships pressed any further, they would be in range of Kanan's surface-to-orbit batteries as well.
Divert power from the engines to shields,
he improvised, moving fluidly from one plan to the next.
Cease offensive fire until we've cleared the minefield.
The Venerable First penetrated the minefield with ease, once Commander Asvori had given them a strategy. Most other vanguards would have been crippled or forced to retreat by this attack, but the best of the Trellian Confederacy did not fall easily. The 3rd Task Squadron was first to breach the minefield. At Asvori's orders, it dove into the fray as if it were a single ship, keeping tight formation as it eviscerated human warships and defense stations. Decades of fleet exercises, simulator training, and live combat had honed these crews' teamwork to near perfection. While the Kanan defenses were distracted with the 3rd Squadron, the rest of the vanguard broke through the minefield and engaged them with renewed fury. At range, with the support of the orbital railguns, the human armada stood a chance. But up close and personal, where Trellian wolfpack tactics and the speed of their ships could be used to its greatest extent, they were being torn apart. Lances from the Exemplary blew apart an orbital railgun as the Confederate flagship closed on Kanan's surface. Missiles, launched from silos on the planet's surface, exploded around it. Most were batted aside by the Exemplary's advanced defense grid, but the few that made it through the hail of laser fire were snuffed out with contempt by its nigh-impenetrable shields.
"We are in range of the Kanan ground defenses, Vanguard Commander," an officer announced. "Getting a targeting solution now."
There was only one order left to be given. Commander Asvori gave it.
"Open fire."
Dozens of high-energy particle beams, each one charged with the force of a small atomic bomb, shot down onto the surface of Kanan. Missile silos, buried deep underground for defense against bombardment, were eradicated in seconds by the unstoppable beams. The Trellian warship was melting their layers of protective rock right onto their bunker roofs.
"Missile fire is dying down, Vanguard Commander, though I suspect some silos have been held in reserve." "A wise thought," Asvori complimented his subordinate. "I will relay ships to deal with any missile silos that arise."
Then he turned back to commanding the battle at large. By this point, a Trellian victory was all but certain. The Venerable First Vanguard, though outnumbered and outgunned, had decimated the human fleet and all but eradicated their orbital defenses. To Commander Asvori's pleasant surprise, he found that there were no heavy guns hidden on the far side of Canaan. The planet's entire defensive force had been clustered on one side of the planet, banking on their powerful opening strike to win the fight before it had begun. The humans were good, Asvori could warrant them that, but the first vanguard was better. And, watching his few remaining enemies limp away from Canaan, Commander Asvori had to conclude that they were victorious.
"Call the captured ships forward to meet with the first vanguard," he ordered, "and inform Confederate command of our situation. Barring any unexpected shows of force from our enemy, I believe the day is won."
But the Terran Armada would not give up so easily. They had not abandoned the fight over Canaan. They had simply left to regroup with their reinforcements.
Contact!
Just minutes after the ragtag human fleet finished their retreat from the combat zone, they had returned, and with a vengeance, it seemed.
21 ships! 3 capital class, 7 city class, 11 settlement class!
Commander Asvori turned his attention back to the status map.
Picking up readings,
his sensor commander announced.
Blood and iron, he breathed. That's a really big ship.
There was one contact, in the center of the human fleet, larger than all the rest. A country class, it was dubbed. Nearly 3 times the size of the Exemplary, and over 4 times the size of the largest human ship it had fought. Confederate intelligence had long wondered why the shipyards of Earth had experienced a drop in fleet production in the late stages of the war. The prevailing theory among their agents was that, having lost many of their systems and colonies, the humans were simply short of raw materials to sustain their massive industry. Watching the country class on his status map, listening to the combat alarms shriek, and the crewmen prepare for battle, Vanguard Commander Asvori began to realize that this theory was wrong.
"Do not be frightened, soldiers," he confidently assured his fleet. "Look at the way that behemoth moves. Less than half the speed of my Exemplary, and we're the slowest in the fleet."
The human country class did not appear to be a ship built for speed. If it was, its designers had clearly failed. Even its escort fleet, whose ships were notoriously slower than those of the Trellian Confederacy, had to move at 2/3 speed for the hulk to keep pace.
"It should be a simple thing to outflank and destroy this monstrosity."
Commander Asvori looked at his fleet's status. 13 ships remained of the original 37. Asvori organized them into 2 squadrons of 4, which would engage the human escorts, and 1 squadron of his 5 best ships. This unit, with the Exemplary at its head, would engage the country class directly and destroy it with a variation of Confederate small craft tactics. After all, the difference between a capital ship and the human behemoth was about the same as a picket or frigate would have with the Exemplary.
"All ships, you have your commands."
Asvori spoke with the kind of confidence one could get only by watching enemy fleets crumble before them. Confidence in a victory that had yet to be won. In most other commanders, it would have been arrogance.
"Carry them out."
In his mind, which was already busy creating a decision tree of moves and countermoves, victory was nearly certain. Within minutes, the venerable First Vanguard was in firing range of the human fleet. Knowing that Trellian craft excelled in close-quarters fighting, the standard operating plan for any human battle fleet was to maintain distance and peck away at the Confederate ships before they could close in. In fact, the latest models of Terran Armada craft sported powerful reverse thrusters and formidable spinal railguns because of precisely such tactics. Any student at the Confederate School of Astral Dominance who guessed that the fleet facing Asvori was aiming to keep its distance and trade fire at range would have received top marks from their instructor. They would, however, have been wrong. The human fleet did not attempt to keep its distance against the venerable First Vanguard. Instead, it closed in.
"Something's wrong," Asvori mused. "They're not fools."
"Their country class is likely integral to their command structure,"
his liaison suggested.
"I recommend dealing with it first."
The country class in question was busy firing its long-range cannons at the fleet. Railgun shells impacted the Exemplary's energy shields like hail in a Canaanite storm. It weathered the barrage with ease. This vessel, while it appeared formidable, clearly lacked the firepower to give truth to its enemy's perception. Or at least, that was how things seemed.
Negative, as Vori told the liaison. Have my ships continue firing on the human escort fleet, but decelerate us and keep our ships at range. Once we've thinned their numbers sufficiently, we will close in and engage the country class with superior numbers and wolfpack tactics. A certain victory for the Venerable first.
And if its short-range weapons are too powerful for us to close the distance? The liaison asked. That ship might be concealing its true power. It could be a trap.
Then we shall simply withdraw from the field and engage it at range with our heavy batteries.
Commander Asvori enjoyed being questioned. It was one of the few scenarios he could think of that allowed him to both elevate his own strategic thinking and impress his wisdom on that of his officers.
Look at how slowly that thing moves. It won't be able to match our maneuverability, even on its best of days. Even if its guns have triple our own battery's firepower, my ships can endure long enough to escape to long range.
Then he turned to his other officers.
Divert power to weapons, if you would. I want that fleet to take losses.
The human fleet, with one massive and sluggish exception, was made up of battle-damaged craft still reeling from their defeat at Canaan. The Trellian force, on the other hand, was relatively intact. Naturally, in spite of their numerical disadvantage, the venerable First Vanguard was able to butcher the approaching human armada. Within 10 minutes, the only human ships left were either disabled or fleeing. Only the flagship remained, slow and durable like the tortoises of Earth, shrugging off hits from the Exemplary's most powerful cannons as if it was being fired upon with laser pointers. Its batteries, though they were returning fire, struggled to hit with any real impact. Asvori wondered if his enemy might have been pulled out of the shipyards a few months too early. Still, he had a duty to perform, and he was not going to complain if he was fighting an unfinished ship.
All ships, the time has come,
Commander Asvori declared.
Split into 4 task squadrons, close on the enemy craft, and maneuver to its weak points in accordance with the anti-capital ship strategy employed by our small vessels. I know this task is daunting. I know this enemy is redoubtable, but we are still venerable. Remember your training, and we'll make it out of this with our pride and hulls intact.
At his orders, the 8 remaining Confederate ships closed on the human warship. They boosted power to their engines and weapons, aiming to deliver a heavy punch on the ponderous craft while avoiding any return fire. Commander Asvori was a very brave man, but even he did not want to get caught by a broadside from the enemy ship's main guns. He felt greatly relieved when the return fire did not increase in strength.
You see, he proclaimed, their short-range cannons are not as fearsome as we feared.
Then he gave his orders.
All task squadrons, surround the enemy vessel and target its primary weapons. Then move to secondary weapons. Then eliminate the defensive arrays and ready your marines for boarding.
This was a deviation from the standard anti-capital ship battle doctrine. Asvori was known to improvise on-the-spot maneuvers frequently when a better plan presented itself.
If that ship's armor is as thick as it seems, we'll never get through with our energy lancers. Capturing it, even if disarmed, is our best option.
The Confederate fleet began to divide into 4 squadrons, each comprising 2 ships, and they split up along 4 predetermined attack vectors. Energy lances bathed the human ship in light, though they failed to penetrate its powerful shields, and cannons the size of starships took aim to return fire.
Stand by for evasive action,
Asvori ordered with confidence. Then he looked at the enemy craft's energy readings. Railguns that powerful would have fit well among the orbital platforms of Canaan. Immediately, he realized that the ship's apparent weakness was a ploy. He had been tricked.
All ships, Commence evasive maneuvers!
It mattered little. It was too late now.
Divert power to!
The cannons fired. 3 of the smaller Confederate ships were blasted into pieces by a single shot each. The larger ones, the city and capital ships, were left crippled at best. Even Asvori's own exemplary was left disabled by the consecutive impacts of 5 railgun slugs.
Status report!
Asvori barked. His officers, though shaken and afraid, delivered him their reports with the professionalism he would expect of the men and women of the venerable First Vanguard. None of them looked good.
Vanguard Commander, what are your orders?
One asked. Her companions were quick to repeat the question. Even flying in a crippled hulk, with battered armor and broken weapons, they had some measure of faith in their commander's judgment. If Asvori could not deliver a victory, then no one could.
What are your orders?
The officer repeated.
Commander, the enemy guns are recharging!
Another officer called out.
It'll take them time to get to full strength, but even at partial power, they can still turn our ship to scrap metal. Your orders!
Asvori looked to his officers, then to his status map. He wasn't sure which of them looked more bleak. Finally, with a sigh of ignoble defeat, he turned to his liaison.
Open a communications line to the human ship,
he said with a heavy heart.
I will not waste the lives of my men.
Vanguard Commander Asvori, the last truly venerable leader of the Trellian Confederacy's first stellar vanguard, summoned up all the strength left in his broken and beaten soul to speak the phrase he had heard so many times before. Never once had he believed he'd be the one to say it.
I believe the only option left is an unconditional surrender.